Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar from Greenstone on reporting the impacts of COVID-19 in your environmental reports. Thank you for joining us today. While we go through today's 30-minute webinar, if you have questions, then please do feel free to put those into the questions box as part of GoToWebinar so that we can address those questions and come back to everybody. So I'm David Wynn, I'm the Managing Director for North America at Greenstone. And for today's agenda, we're going to be having a look at the COVID impact on data acquisition for environmental reporting. We're then going to have a look at how COVID has impacted boundaries and materiality. And then we're going to look at business travel and how companies are reporting that. And then a hot topic I know we've had some questions on already is about working from home emissions and how those could or should be included. And then finally, we'll have a look at COVID impacts on environmental targets. So quite a lot to cover in today's session, so I'm going to get stuck in. But as I say, please do send questions through as they arise. So for those not familiar with Greenstone, we're an award-winning sustainability software company. We provide software solutions to organizations to enable them to report data to become more responsible businesses. So the first topic we're going to look at is how COVID has impacted data acquisition. And this set of diagrams here is from a KPMG report in 2020. And it's useful to have a look at because what this report did is it looked at the different phases of how COVID is impacting organizations and the business action and response to those different phases. So the first phase in terms of the impact of COVID on many organizations was that respond phase. And that's the first part of when they were actually responding to the initial impact that it was having on their business and their operations. Next, then the relief period was where that company may have then been coping with the pandemic. So actively trying to contribute towards flattening the curve within different geographies that they're operating within. The third phase then is about recovery, and that's the time period wherein companies and the world more broadly is looking at how to manage around the pandemic and resuming operations. And then finally, the resilience phase. So this is looking at building for the future and how that company will change. And so different organizations will be at different stages of this. And so many companies hopefully are towards the recovery and resilience phases within there. But obviously your own operations may feel the impacts of COVID in different parts of how you're actually operating. And so when it's come to environmental reporting, some of the key challenges that we've seen for organizations during the last year or so has been, firstly, data being trapped on site. So for many companies, moving to working from home operations or to different locations has meant that they didn't necessarily have processes in place to be able to access data that would have physically been in some of their locations. There's also then been issues with staff being furloughed purely from a resource standpoint and suppliers not being able to provide resources. Another challenge has been centralizing data. So where historically there might have been different data in different locations, not having that within a centralized place has been something that's been quite common. And so solutions-wise, what we've seen from the data standpoint are firstly companies starting to model data. So for their 2020 footprints, if they haven't had environmental data for some points or some locations, instead relying on modeling techniques to be able to carry out that gap filling. And similarly, estimations as well. So asking those data contacts to actually estimate data rather than providing actuals, as well as relying on third-party benchmarks as well. And then more broadly thinking about future-proofing, what we've seen is organizations moving their systems and processes online. This applies more broadly than just environmental reporting, but for many operations, they may have had loose cultural processes based on being in the same office or location. And so instead, moving online has meant that having to document those has been something that's needed to be done. And specifically on the environmental side, putting in place data management plans. So either creating those for the first time or reviewing those so that you actually have a plan in place and a process for how data is collected, approved, managed, and reported. From a technology standpoint, one of the key things we've seen in software is companies making more use of tracking variances within data. So inevitably, as a result of 2020 shifting how companies operate, what we've seen from a greenhouse gas perspective is large shifts in maybe the data between 2019 and 2020. And so being able to account for those variances and distribute variance requests to different users has been a functional piece that companies have definitely been much more interested in for their 2020 reporting than they may have been historically. So that's brought some of the challenges in terms of how companies are actually collecting information. The other impact then of COVID has been on boundaries and materiality. So going back to our original stages that we had a look at of respond, relief, recover, and resilience. If we think about that then in terms of the impact on boundaries and materiality. So in that first phase where companies were responding to the initial impacts of COVID, what we saw was companies reprioritizing material topics. And often that was through internal discussions on realigning communications or strategies to deal with that initial pandemic response. Following on from that, then in the relief phase, we then see organizations reclassifying material topics. And one of the key things that they may then do is look at the definitions of short, medium, and long-term issues, prioritizing those and what that then means for them in the context of their business. Longer term then, beyond that, when thinking about the recovery phase of COVID, it's then really about looking at a materiality assessment. And for most organizations, they would do a materiality assessment every couple of years. And so it may be then an opportune time to look at those topics that are material for the business from a data collection standpoint, but also then the processes and mechanisms internally to be able to manage how a materiality assessment is conducted and then the frequency in which it's updated. And then finally, in that resilience phase, it's really about aligning materiality with those longer term horizons. We've seen a lot of companies in the last year or so setting science-based targets, net zero targets, and so understanding materiality with the context of that long-term target setting is something that we've seen as a key impact from COVID. We hosted a Greenstone webinar last week around the net zero and science-based targets. So if you haven't attended that, then please do check that out on our past webinars page on the Greenstone website. So then when we think about boundaries and materiality and the impact that COVID has had, this diagram many of you may have seen before from the GHG protocol when we have a look at the different scopes under which greenhouse gas emissions are reported. And for some organizations, they may not have necessarily looked in that much detail at their upstream activities and their downstream activities within scope 3 before. Companies may have historically focused on scope 1 and 2 emissions, And so other categories like capital goods or waste generated in operations or leased assets may be areas of data collection and impacts that haven't been explored historically. One of the results of COVID-19 has been the impact on supply chains. And so as a result of companies then looking at their suppliers and the impact COVID has had on how their suppliers are required to engage with them, that's really put a focus on some of these other areas within Scope 3. Tie that into the science-based target and net zero commitments that I mentioned. Again, those have a very broad lens, and so they're looking across the whole aspect, all the different scopes of what a company would be reporting. So when we think about some of the longer term impacts that COVID might have on boundaries and materiality, what we're seeing is this evolution of what materiality assessments might look like, and the concept of more dynamic ESG issues, which might become material for a certain amount of time within a framework of broader topics. Alongside that, obviously, technology is only increasing, and from a data standpoint, things like AI, as well as machine learning, is really providing opportunities for ESG data providers to be able to improve materiality assessments from a data acquisition standpoint. The other aspect then of materiality and boundaries is, for many organizations, there might be a shift in how data is reported. So some of the content that you might be putting out in annual sustainability reports is fine to continue on an annual basis, but there may be particular stakeholder groups, such as investors, who would want or anticipate more frequent reporting on particular KPIs within that. And so separating that content delivery into different cycles is something that we would anticipate as well. Today we're focusing on the environmental side, but of course as well, there's a whole huge area around social issues as well, which are covered within the context of COVID, that companies will definitely be focusing on beyond the E and ESG. So when COVID hit and companies were starting to think about their 2020 environmental reports, one of the most common questions or points we get asked about is business travel, particularly companies within professional services or client-led industries that may have had historically large amounts of business travel and then are not traveling at all during 2020, and how to report on that information during that period. So this is a diagram taken from the GHG protocol methodology. And this just very simply outlines the different steps for calculating travel emissions, where the first priority is using fuel consumption, the second using distance, and then the third using spend information. So we've seen some companies need to rely on spend information for 2020 if they've not had that data. But on the whole, the greater level of accuracy within business travel data that can be obtained means that you're able to report in a more valuable way on what the actual impacts of COVID were on business travel. So when organizations report on greenhouse gas emissions from travel, there's a few different things that are important to keep in mind. The first is the split between business travel, freight travel, and commuter travel, and ensuring those are separated within reporting into different buckets. Within there, then, the more accurate that data can become, it means that you're able to apply more accurate emission factors to them. So there's just a simple example here where from DEPRA 2021 emission factors for air business long haul, there's a large difference between the emission factors based on seat class. So for companies that may not have that granularity at the moment and are simply estimating based on cost, if you're able to think about improving that data quality, then it's really going to provide more granularity in how the emissions are calculated, and then a greater level of accuracy around the impacts as a result of COVID or modal shift. Other aspects of granularity that we often see within business travel are splitting data between client travel and non-client travel, looking at route type information for modal shift, and then also looking at aspects around ICT hardware and video conferencing, because those facilities, even pre-COVID, were topics that companies were looking at to be able to try and pair up data around investments in video conferencing technology, and then looking at how that may have impacted travel. And then finally, not to forget about hotel stays. So included within business travel emissions, there are country level emission factors for hotel night stays. So a few areas there around business travel, and that's definitely a topic that companies have been very interested in trying to get more accurate data on to be able to report on. The other one that we're hearing a lot of information or a lot of questions about is working from home emissions. So for many companies, they may not have reported this before, and so this will be something newer for them to look at. And within operations, there are large regional differences in terms of how working from home has impacted based on the type of organization that you are, the geographies that you're operating within, the national action in terms of how COVID is being managed in different geographies. And so there's an example on this slide here from within the UK, where in 2020, there was an increase in working from home emissions overall, but there were large regional differences within that between different parts of the UK and also within different professions as well. So before we have a look at some of the calculations around working from home, we're now going to launch just a quick poll to poll the audience around working from home emissions. So hopefully this will now come up. So hopefully you can now see the poll on the screen, which gives you the options to select. So has your company reported working from home emissions? There's options here for yes, we've calculated and reported them. No, but we've started to look into it. Or no, it's not something we have considered. So I'll just give everybody a few seconds to respond to the poll. And then hopefully we should now see those results. So unsurprisingly, for most companies, it's not something that they've considered or something that they've looked at before, and only about 12% of people have calculated and reported them. So that's useful to understand and not surprising. So let's have a little closer look at what we mean by working from home emissions. So when we think about working from home emissions, offices made environmental reporting easier. When you think about a company, you think about their offices and their sites, you think about the bills that they pay, and you think about then the emissions associated with those activities. And this shift with companies now having employees working from home has meant that a lot of the emissions associated with a company's operations are now off of the balance sheet in terms of what the company is then paying for. And for some, in some thinking, this brings up the topic of what is sometimes termed scope 4 emissions. Now, it's important to point out this is just conceptual and it's not something that's officially part of the GHG protocol. But the idea of scope 4 emissions has evolved to include two main buckets, the first of which is avoided emissions from a company, and the second of which is the idea of working from home emissions, and the fact that if you're employing somebody, even though they're working from home, you're still taking account and responsible for some of their emissions. And as we move now in many organizations to more hybrid models of working, the impacts then that the company are having from having all of those staff working from home, how should those be accounted for in your own corporate footprints? So one school of thinking behind that is that those could be included in a scope 4 category. And this could then create a culture around companies being stewards of staff emissions, commutes, home energy use, and air quality. And the business then taking greater responsibility of ensuring that staff are working in a sustainable environment then going forward. Just like our poll, historically, very few companies have reported on working from home emissions. In the GHG protocol category 7 employee commuting, there is a reference to teleworking emissions, but it's not specifically outlined in very much detail at all. And so what we're seeing now is companies that want to start collecting this, there's two main approaches to doing this. The first approach would be to estimate the working from home emissions based on the geography and details of your staff based on where they are. And the second would be to conduct an employee survey to try and capture more granular data points about the nature of their working from home, and then taking into account the emissions associated with that. So some of the key data points in the survey would be the number of employees, business hours, geographies of workers, energy used at home. And then some companies have also then drawn the boundary of working from home emissions around the technology that's being used. I'm conducting today's webinar from a Greenstone laptop at my house. And so the idea would be that the asset register of the company would then take account for the emissions associated with the machines that you're using within home environments. So there's a couple of different methodologies for how you'd go about doing that. And as I say, this is evolving because it's not something that's hugely established. On this next graph, though, we're going to dig into a little bit more data and detail. And so this graph here is from the IEA. We'll be sharing links and follow-up information to today's webinar, so you'll be able to access this data. But the IEA have conducted a study to look at the average change in energy demand and emissions from one day of home working for a single household with a car commute. So they've looked at this for different geographies. And so this graph here covers the United States, China, and the European Union. To the right-hand side of the graph, for the dark blue and the green, that's the increase in emissions as a result of energy use at home. So it's the net increase in energy and therefore emissions as a result of one person working from home. When reporting on working from home emissions, what we don't want to do is report all of the emissions from somebody's energy use at home. They could have a huge home with lots of people inside it. And so what you're wanting to report is just the net increase as a result of that employee working from home rather than working in the office. And so that's what these figures are doing for different geographies on the right-hand side, taking into account typical consumption of energy and the emissions factors in those geographies. On the left-hand side of the graph then, the light blue, this is the emission savings as a result of that person not commuting to work. And the commute to work in each of the three geographies is based on an average car commute. So in the United States, the average car commute is about 18 kilometers. In China, it's about 8 kilometers. And in the EU, it's about 15 kilometers. And then in the US, the average energy use of a vehicle is higher than in those other geographies. So what it's saying is that obviously as a result of your member of staff working from home, they're going to be using more energy in their house. And so that's our increase in emissions from using energy at home, but they're reducing their emissions by not commuting to work. And so in this example, we end up with a net reduction in terms of the emissions in each of these examples from that person working from home. Now, one of the other considerations is that this is all based on car commute data. So as we discussed in the slide before, if you were conducting a survey and you were able to gather information from employees about how they commute, the distances they commute, then you would really be able to get much more accurate picture of what the net increase in emissions is as a result of your staff working from home as opposed to coming into the office. A couple of other key findings here from the IEA. So for staff that commute by car, working from home is likely to reduce their CO2 footprint if their journey to work is greater than about 6 kilometers. But for shorter commutes, as I say, on public transport, it's likely to have the opposite effect in terms of the emissions will go up because of the residential energy consumption. It's no surprise that as a result of COVID-associated lockdowns, the energy from domestic environments jumped up last year, where companies were increasingly using that at home. And then if we look at a global level, the IEA have done research looking at the overall net decrease in the emissions if everybody was working from home within there. So just a couple of stats there. And the data that from that study, we've seen examples where companies are using that to then estimate the overall emissions impact, either just based on desk research, applying it to where the staff are located, or pairing that then with a survey to really get more granular information to be able to apply those emissions estimates to working from home. Our final topic for today is just looking at environmental targets. So this graph here is looking at the global CO2 emissions over time. And on the graph, there's a couple of points where you can see global financial crises, oil crises, and those dips that are seen then within the emissions at a global level. When we talk to people about the impacts of COVID, often there can be a perception that COVID is just going to completely slash emissions and really reduce it because we're not traveling and everyone's at home. And actually, when you look at it in a global context, this graph here shows the forecast for where the 2020 emissions are estimated to be. And those emissions are in line with the 1.5 degrees scenarios. And so IPCC scenarios for where the world needs to move in terms of emissions reductions, we're right on track. And so those decreases, really what we need to avoid is what's happened historically, where that's a temporary blip, and we then are transitioning back to pre-COVID activities, and instead use this as a way to be able to really transition then how businesses recover and how they operate then going forward. So that's a global lens on targets. And then when we look at it in the context of an organization and a business, there's just a screenshot here from the Greenstone software. We see a lot of companies setting longer term targets. And so one of the challenges when setting these longer term science-based targets or net zero targets is then the in-year reporting. So the companies now that are in year 2, year 3 of those targets, what they're wanting to do is look at how they're doing towards those overall targets, and then carrying out variance adjusted calculations for how that target may then need to flex for them to still be able to achieve their longer term reporting goals. So finally, just to close out today, there's some themes and topics here about what to expect next. What we're expecting to see are companies adjusting their reports to obviously report and reflect on the impacts of COVID. And a top tip there is to think about reports, when thinking about reports, is to think about it with the finance teams. Your financial teams are having to report on the financial impacts of COVID in your annual reports. And so collaborating or engaging with them on how they're going to line item impacts due to COVID to create consistency, but to also draw on knowledge is something that we've seen being really valuable within client environments. Obviously, investors will be watching closely, particularly for consistency and completeness, as well as numbers backed by narrative in terms of explaining both the quantitative impacts as well as the narrative around how COVID has impacted your business operations. Accountability during the new reality and an increasing frequency of stakeholder reporting as well are other areas that we would expect to see. So thank you for joining today's webinar. We've had some questions through, and so we will follow up individually with people around those questions, as well as putting together an FAQ document, because we've had quite a lot of content to cover in today's 30-minute session on the impacts of COVID in environmental reporting. So that just leaves me to thank you for joining. Please do check out some of those other webinars around science-based targets and net zero targets on the website, and the Greenstone website for any more information about our sustainability software solutions. Thanks a lot.